So let's take a look at the objectives for this section, section 9.1, Earth forms and life begins. Explain how scientists learn about the history of life on our Earth. Describe how and when the planet formed. Outline how the first organic molecules, so these would be our molecules primarily made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and describe some characteristics and explain how eukaryotic cells are thought to have evolved. So we're going to take a look at these main objects in this section. So one of the most important things to realize is that our Earth is incredibly old. It's 4.6 billion years old. We're going to talk a little bit how we know that, but for the time being, it's 4.6 billion years old, and life seems to have appeared 4 billion years ago. So how do we know that? That's because we have fossils for it. We have fossils, and we're able to date the rock that's around those fossils. The evolution of life wasn't always smooth and steady, far from it. So there's lots of ebbs and flows. Giant meteorites struck the Earth's surface, continents drifted and shifted, ice ages came and went. And at least 5 times during this 4.6 billion years old, there were major what are called extinction events. And that's where a lot of life was reduced in number and diversity, but managed to make its way back. So one of the things that's really difficult is to give students a perspective on life on our planet. And what your textbook does with this diagram is to try and give you a perspective on when things evolved on life. So this round sphere you see here represents a 24-hour clock. So here's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4, 5, and 6 o'clock, all the way down to 12 o'clock, up to 18, and up to 24. So let's take a look at this. If the Earth's history, the entire Earth's history, was divided into 24 equal hours, the best evidence we have is that when the Earth first formed, it was completely molten, and it took a long time. It took hundreds of millions of years for solid rock to appear. But once solid rock appeared, in the ocean, we have evidence, fossil evidence, way back here of the first prokaryotic life. Now notice, so for hundreds of millions of years, prokaryotic life existed, and only prokaryotic life. Then some forms of prokaryotic life were able to photosynthesize. Now, it's interesting that the photosynthesis we know uses water, H2O, but the photosynthesis back here initially used H2S. So these organisms, all prokaryotic, using H2S, were able to photosynthesize, capture the energy from the sun. So look, almost half of the time has gone by until all of a sudden, into the free atmosphere, some of these organisms started to switch over to H2O, and free oxygen manages to get into our atmosphere. Then, around this time, about let's see, that would be almost 1 a.m., eukaryotes evolved, then multicellular life, then animals the way we know them, land vertebrates. So not until, almost 2.5 hours ago, in this 24-hour clock, the first land vertebrates were found, and then mammals, and then flowering plants, and then hominids. The word hominid means human-like, were found just in this sliver of time. And how can we say that? 2 reasons. We have the fossil evidence, but we also can date the rocks around where those fossils are found. I wanted to give you another way of thinking about this. This is another 24-hour clock that starts up here, where it says begins, and moves all the way down. And it follows different periods. We'll see these periods later on. But I'd like you to take a look. So the first 21 hours, the first 21 of the 24 hours, we only had unicellular life. We had photosynthesis about 5:30 a.m. The first eukaryotes around and multicellular life about 5:30 p.m. We're going to be talking in this section about the Miller-Urey experiment. Well, it's this period in time when the first unicellular life takes place where we first have the fossil evidence for this. The Miller-Urey experiment is trying to simulate what the atmosphere and what the oceans were like on the planet back then. And they wanted to see if they could create organic molecules. And it's a really, really interesting, and it's an important experiment for this chapter that you understand. And you're going to see an animation on it, and we're going to talk about it from the picture in the text as well. Another and really important event is something called the Cambrian explosion. So through this period of time, from midnight when the Earth first formed in our 24-hour clock till almost 9 p.m., life is very simple. It's prokaryotic bacteria and it's eukaryotic, but these are one-celled organisms living in the ocean. There's no life forms on land. Everything's in the ocean. But then around this time, about 9 p.m., so 3 hours, 3 hours from today, the Cambrian explosion. And we're going to talk about what happens in the Cambrian explosion. But all of this happens in that remaining 3 hours. All of this time passes by. So most of the history of life on Earth, we were very simple, one-celled organisms. Then the Cambrian explosion, and we'll talk about why that happened. So I mentioned that one of the ways that we know that life has been around for a long time are through fossils. And fossils come in amazingly big and large and small ways. So for example, take a look at this one, the saber-toothed cat. The saber-toothed cat, believe it or not, was found by a first expedition to Florida that was sent from Philadelphia from the Wagner Free Institute of Science at 17th and Montgomery in Philadelphia. So this is a saber-toothed cat fossil, and you can tell it's very well detailed, and none of these are left. We don't have them anymore. They've become extinct. But there are also fossils that are tiny, like this one. This is tree sap, which is called amber. And inside here, we have two insects. We have a spider, which you can see clearly here, and up here we can see a mosquito, which has also been captured in the amber. This is one way. Another way for life to become fossilized. Some fossils have amazing detail. For example, take a look at this fish. We can see its backbone in here. We can see the eye. We can see up here where the brain was. We can see the incredible detail that's in, in this shale, which is the rock that surrounds it. It's a sedimentary rock. Another way that we can tell how old fossils are is by their what's called relative dating. And relative dating means, okay, if we find a fossil down here, this one's a trilobite, but up here we find an ammonite. If geologists tell us that these layers have not been disturbed and they have not been turned over, then this fossil must be younger than this fossil down here. So that's called relative dating. Make sure you read up about that. This is an important diagram, and in this one we're going from the origin of the Earth down at the bottom here. If you take a look at the bottom, it'll say origin of the Earth, and then it says 4.6 billion years ago. We're saying years ago, so this is 4.6 billion years ago, 3.8, 5 point, but then we get to 544 million years ago. Remember, a billion years is 1,000 million years. I know it's hard to get your head around, but right here, this is where we're going to be exploring in the rest of this chapter a little bit. Because remember, life was pretty simple in here, but we're going to be examining these eras, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, in the next section. So kind of take a look at this. Notice over here, this column is important, how many years ago, billions and millions of years ago, and the era. Don't worry too much about the period, but have a sense that this section represents 544 million years ago. So that's only like 500 million years ago. So one of the major questions that scientists try to answer is, how did life get here? And ancient Earth, this picture, this is how ancient Earth may have looked after its atmosphere and oceans formed. And there was a famous experiment done by two scientists, Miller and Urey, that said, hey, what if we tried to simulate what the ancient Earth was like? So this is the setup for Miller and Urey's experiment. And up here in the upper right, I'm going to have the letter I, where you can click out to an animation that just does a wonderful job of explaining it, and I'd like you to watch it. So the Miller and Urey demonstrated that organic molecules could form under simulated conditions. So what did that mean? So in this setup, which is closed to the outside, they put some water, salt water simulating the ocean. They heated it a little so some of the water would evaporate up through here, and this is their atmosphere. And into the atmosphere, they thought there would be water vapor, ammonia, methane, carbon monoxide, and then they put a spark through this that would simulate lightning. And when they first set this up, this was all clear. The water was clear. It was all set up, and they thought they were going to set it up, put it in a corner of a lab, and wait for months and months, maybe years, to see if they got anything. Well, the amazing thing about the Miller-Urey experiment, the very first time they did this, they came back after a week, and it was dirty. The inside was dirty. There were other molecules in there. And at first they thought they made a mistake. They took the whole thing down. They cleaned it out. They made sure everything was perfectly spotless. They set it up again. The same thing happened. And what they found in here when they examined it was they found that this setup, starting from simple molecules, had created amino acids. So they had made rich organic molecules, amino acids that make up proteins, from this setup. Please watch the animation that will have a link up here with the letter I. Just click on that. You'll see it probably popped out. The very first cells on the planet, scientists think, were probably, this is a picture of the hypothetical first cell. They may have consisted of little more than a membrane, like this, and instead of having DNA, RNA. RNA is a little bit simpler, but still can contain information. So we think that this is what the very first cells may have looked like. After a couple 100 million years, it says the first eukaryotic cells probably evolved about 2 billion years ago. So this was when the Earth was about 2.6 billion years old. And this is explained by the Endosymbiotic Theory. And that's when different organisms would engulf and cooperate with each other. So as they talk about here, from independent cell to organelle. And in this, we start with two independent bacteria. One bacteria is engulfed by another. One is much bigger, this one here. One bacteria now lives inside the other. Both bacteria benefit from the arrangement, and the internal bacteria are passed from one generation to the next. So let's do a quick lesson summary. Much of what we know about the Earth is based on the fossil record. We know that the Earth was formed about 4.6 billion years ago. The first molecules, organic molecules, formed about 4 billion years ago. The first cells, we just talked about those, and photosynthesis evolved about 3 billion years ago. Eukaryotic cells evolved about 2 billion years ago. So what I'd like you to do, here is a screenshot from that wonderful animation, and the eye is in the upper right. Please take a look at this. This was section 9.1. How did life start here? Is the question scientists are trying to answer.